Okay, in this video we're going to go ahead and start looking at some of the options available to us through the render setup window. Now this stuff is very technical. We're going over a lot of parameters. I know it's not really that much fun and probably not very interesting. I promise to you the tutorial will get much more interesting as we go further on, but you really need to know about these options before we go any further. If you don't, you're not going to be able to take full advantage of rendering in 3ds Max, and you're not going to learn that much. So you pretty much have to go through this in order to get into rendering, but don't worry, it's sort of a one-time deal. Once you get used to all these options and parameters and things, it becomes very easy and second nature later on. So just hang in there and bear with me as we go over these options. So let's go up here to the main rendering window here, and we're going to hit the render setup here. Shortcut is F10. Let's open up the render setup, and whoa, that is a lot of options we get there. So we can see in the render setup window for the default scanline renderer, we have tons and tons of options. Now this window is made up of many different components. We have the different tabs up here that we can see, and each one has many different parameters. And in each tab, we have different roll-ups. For example, the common parameters roll up here, then we have other ones down here. Some of them are hidden because there's so many, the window can't even encompass all of them. And in each one of those parameter rollouts, we have tons of other parameters, and those parameters may have other parameters associated, and so on and so forth. And you can see that the rabbit hole goes pretty deep. But don't worry about that. I'm not going to bombard you with too much information in this video. We're just going to go over probably the most common and probably the most used parameters, so you get an idea of what's going on here and how to use this render setup window. So the first tab by default here is the common tab up here. You can see we have a renderer tab, advanced lighting, ray tracer, and render elements. Let's go ahead and look at the common tab first. The first parameter rollout is called the common parameters. That's the first rollout, and we get different options. Under time output, we can select what we want to render out in terms of time. Do we want to render out a single rendered still, a single image, one render? Or do we want to render out the entire time segment, which right now is set from 0 to 100 frames? So do we want to render out about 3 seconds of animation? Or do we want to change that range to whatever we want? So say from 0 to say 5,000 if you really wanted to, or whatever you want, or whatever you need. You can also set the frames here. You can set a different number of frames. Say if you want to render frames by default, what's set up here as an example is frames 1. Maybe you want to render also frame 3. Maybe you also want to render from frame 5 to 12. Whatever you want, you can select. 3ds Max allows you to do it. From here, we can also select, this should look familiar to you from the rendered frame window, the area to render. We can render out, again, view, selected, region, crop, blow up. We can also select auto region selected. We can also set the output size of the image. This is extremely important. You have to know the output size of the image that you're going to render to. Is this going to be HD? Is it going to be standard definition? Are you going to render out something that's 640 by 480 or 720 by 486 or what? Right here you can choose different presets. 320 by 240, again 640 by 480, or you can put in a custom size. You can also go here to the output size drop down box and select presets. So we can select a preset for say NTSC DV video. We can set up a preset for HD TV, PAL video for our friends in Europe, and so on and so forth. Down here under options, we can choose different options for rendering. Now I'm not going to go over these because you probably don't know what these are, and this really isn't the time to talk about these things. We'll talk about these more when we get into effects and the different environments and things like that. Then we have advanced lighting. We can tell 3ds Max to render using advanced lighting or to not render using advanced lighting. And we'll spend a lot of time and quite a number of videos talking about advanced lighting 3ds Max. Right now it probably makes no sense to you and you have no idea what advanced lighting is besides the fact that it sounds like lighting that's advanced. But we'll get into that in a while, a little bit later. Okay, then we have different options down here. We can select to output our render to the hard drive. So if we click on that, we can go ahead and select a different format for our render. So we can save out to an AVI file, which I do not recommend. We can also save out to image sequences in bitmap format. We can save out in HDR format, JPEG, OpenEXR, which I do recommend, QuickTime Movies, and if we scroll down here, we have even more Targas and TIFFs and all kinds of different formats, pretty much for anything that you need. And it'll save those out to your hard drive wherever you choose. I recommend sticking to the render output directory that 3ds Max automatically chooses for this project directory, just to stay nice and organized. We can also do different things down here. We can go down to the assign renderer parameter rollout down here, and we could choose a different production renderer. Right now, the default scanline renderer is the one chosen. If we click on this icon here, we get a list of different renderers. 3ds Max comes with a view file renderer and a Mentoray renderer. Now, the Mentoray renderer is an industry-based production renderer used by lots of different studios for broadcast and film and lots of different applications. We're not going to be talking about the Mentoray renderer in this tutorial, however. We're going to be focusing on the default scanline renderer. Okay, so let me click on that parameter rollout to collapse it, and let's move on to the next tab. Over here we have the renderer tab. The renderer tab allows us to change different render and performance options associated with the scanline renderer, which is the current active renderer. As we can see up here in the render setup window, it tells us default scanline renderer, so we know which renderer we're using. So here we can choose different options. Again, we're not going to talk too much about this right now, unless it pertains to what the subject is. And right now, that'll be kind of veering off of what we're talking about. Over here, we have an important performance option here, anti-aliasing. Anti-aliasing, when turned off, will produce rougher, uglier images of lower quality, but it will render them out fast. I recommend rendering out without anti-aliasing when you're still doing test renders and you're not ready for production render yet. This way you can do your test renders fast and get them done quickly, so you can finish your project faster and get to a final result quicker. When you're ready for a final production render with all the bells and whistles and make it look nice and pretty, go ahead and turn on anti-aliasing to go ahead and give you nicer, crisper, smoother images. Okay, we can also choose different anti-aliasing filters, and we'll talk about that more later, as well as changing the filter size and so on and so forth. We also have some other things down here. We can turn on motion blur for objects, image motion blur, and all kinds of different things. Let's go over here to render elements. Render elements allows us to go ahead and click on add here, and we can render out different channels or different elements of the render. We can render out just shadows, or just self-illumination, or just the reflections, or just the specularity of our image. We can render out Z-depth. We can render out all kinds of different things, diffuse color. We can render out hair and fur and a separate pass, and so on and so forth. We also have a ray tracer tab here, and this tab gives us access to all the ray tracer options. In case if our render is taking too long to render, we can adjust the ray tracer parameters here, because ray tracing takes so long to render and it's so computationally expensive. We can also come over here to advanced lighting and activate advanced lighting. We'll talk about advanced lighting very, very much during further tutorials as we move along. And we're not going to talk about it now, but we do have a couple of options here for advanced lighting. We have a light tracer and radiosity. And we're going to be talking about each one of those in depth later on. By the end of this entire tutorial, you'll know exactly what light tracer and radiosity mean, how they work, and how to use them to your advantage. So, that's going to do it for the render setup window. I think we've gone long enough. I know we haven't talked about every single parameter here, but if I did, chances are it's just going to probably confuse you more and overwhelm you with just way too much stuff, and I didn't want to bombard you with too much. So the render setup window in a nutshell is where you come to set up all of your parameters and all of your settings for when you're going to render. Things like the size of the final image, the format of the image, if the image is going to be a JPEG or a Targa or whatever it's going to be, if you're going to render out a still, or if you're going to render out a whole sequence to an animation, and so on and so forth. That's what the render setup does, and that's what it's useful for. Let me go ahead and close that. That's going to do it for this video. I'll see you in the next one.